Okay, it's time to get started there, Cobb.
I'm going, brother. I'm started. I've been going for a while.
Please take your seats, everyone, or we'll send somebody over to assist you. If you know what I mean, our security team we have. All right, on our sick this morning, of course, we have Hibernia Shepherd who's at home and recovering from her car wreck. And Jerry Kretzinger's back with us. Tommy Hobgood's out. And Gary Lovett, of course, is in Mercy Health, recovering from his back surgery. Tia Lovett is in Lakeway. It says David Butler had a recent scan. Phil? Hello, Phil. Anyway, we don't know the results of that. Maybe I'll find out. So, anybody else sick this morning? Yeah. Good scan. Okay, that's good. So we're thankful for that. Jason's back with us. Okay, yeah, that's. And remind me of her name. Remind me of her name. Anna. Okay. We extend sympathy to the family. Strickland, to the Strickland family. So any more sick?
Margarine Pace is in the Benton Hospital.
Margarine Pace in the Benton Hospital.
She's member here.
All right.
Margarine's 98.
Margarine Pace. Okay. And there appears to be Tia coming in right there. So revise that on her being in Lakeway. Okay, anything else? Okay, Jason.
Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Thank you for being out today on this Lord's Day and a part of our Bible study. We have a number of visitors here with family, and we're so thankful that you're here too. And we hope everyone has a wonderful week. Maybe you have family coming in, or maybe you're going somewhere, or maybe you're staying, but hope you have a wonderful week as you have events moving forward. We're studying in the New Testament, and in the section that has a number of letters written by apostles and various writers of the New Testament to Christian people. And the letter we're studying is called the Letter of James, or the Epistle of James, named after the author, who was the brother of Jesus. And so we've been studying this for 10 or 11 weeks, and we're in the 4th chapter of this letter. James became a very influential man in the church in these early years. In the 4th book of the New Testament, which is the book of Acts, we have the historical account of the beginning of the church and its growth. And in that account, we learn how prominent a figure Jesus' brother, James, became. Now, the interesting thing about that is, as maybe you might even remember, James was not always a supporter of his brother. It was very difficult for Jesus' brothers to get their mind around how indeed unique and special their older brother was. In fact, they made fun of him, as recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 7. And yet something happened wherein his brothers, instead of being his critics, came to believe that their brother was the Christ, the Son of God. And it was the fact that they became convinced, contrary to any expectation on their part, that Jesus was raised from the dead. There are a number of indisputable historical facts that skeptics of Christianity wrestle with. In addition to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person, they reckon with the fact and try to explain and write books and do articles and studies on why was his tomb empty. That's just an indisputable fact that skeptics acknowledge. Wherever he was placed, his tomb was found empty. Number two, they reckon with the fact that although they don't believe in the resurrection, they have to acknowledge people believed that he was. People claimed to see him after his death. And in addition to that, there's an understanding that he was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And then the very difficult thing to comprehend is what happened to people like James. Why, against all odds and all expectation, did people come to believe that this happened? Not only that, how is it that people who would have known best the truth were willing to put their lives on the line if it was indeed known to them to be a lie? Now, people will die for a lie, but that's because they believe it's true. But it's another thing to say, well, they're involved in this grand conspiracy, and it never comes out, and all 12 apostles take it to their deaths. James is among a group of individuals who were skeptical. But he's had a transformation of heart, had a transformation of rational thinking. And now he himself has become influential in those early days, which were very difficult for many people. Because Christians in those early days and years became the objects of intense opposition and persecution and violent persecution. And they witnessed these kinds of things. And how are people going to maintain this unique perspective about Jesus in the face of threats and violence? Despite all that, the church grew, and James was very influential in those days. Now he's writing a letter, and he's trying to do something that really gets under a lot of people's skin. And that's to address what he sees are moral problems, even among Christian people. Right? That's just a territory you're not supposed to go anymore, of challenging people about their behavior. It's mind your own business time in our world today. But James believed that he had a moral obligation to try to help people improve their character in their lives, and that it really would be for the better. That when we do pursue goodness and kindness and love and peace and embrace all the virtues of Christ's teaching, it really does make our families better, our lives better, and our world better. He believed that, and he wrote a letter to try to influence people who were already Christians to press on by looking at themselves, being very honest with themselves, and trying to spur them on to try to be better people. And so he's not trying to be censorious or rude or just kind of negative, but he is trying to live in the real world and say, brothers and sisters, let's hold up the mirror of God's Word, and wherever we find defects or challenges, let's with gratitude and zeal for what Jesus has done, let's make a push to be better people and make our world better. And so in our most recent studies, we've considered his encouragements about conflict. He asks the question when he begins chapter 4, where do conflicts come from? Why do you find certain social circles, whether it's the church or families or workplaces or whatever, why do you find people at each other's throat? And as he begins to analyze this, he says, really what's going on in terms of the source of this condition, this kind of environment of conflict, there's actually a war going on inside you. And it's that tendency to be selfish or get your way or run over other people, to have it your way. And he says, isn't this really part of the problem? That there's a war going on inside us about selfishness or ambition. And we just take it too far and affect our social circles. When we lose this war and just pursue selfishness, there are people that get hurt in the wake of that. And so he asks us to think about this, to analyze it, especially in view of the values Jesus wants us to have. And so in developing this line of teaching, he asks a question. And this is part of his style, you might say, that the letter is filled with questions for the reader. It kind of draws us in. He's asking us to ask ourselves this question. And the question at this transition point in verse 5 is, do you think the scriptures are meaningless? Now, of course, there are a lot of people that say, well, yes, they are. But he's talking to Christian people. He's not in this letter trying to convince the skeptic to take the Word of God seriously. He's talking to people who embrace the moral and spiritual values of Jesus Christ. People who really do believe in the Bible. And he says to them, Bible believer, do you think the Scripture says things in a meaningless way to no profit? Well, the Scriptures tell us that God longs for us to love Him in return, to be loyal to Him. And so there is then this appeal in verses 6 to 10 to keep our perspective in check and to see ourselves in a proper light in relation to our Creator, which would be a humble disposition, a thankful disposition, rather than this pride, arrogance, self-sufficient, ambitious to a fault kind of living for just self. So that's where we now make a transition to consider the last part of the chapter, wherein he encourages us that we should not do something and then that we should do something. And we'll consider this verse by verse in the remainder of our class. Now let's read James chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And as I've done over the several weeks, I'll read from more than one English version just to kind of get a different rendering. It says the same thing, but as I've said before, I was raised reading the King James and the American Standard, and yet they were translated hundreds of years ago, and it sounds so familiar. It just sounds right. But then when I read a newer version like the ESV, I get a little different wording that maybe is a little more natural. I'm not saying it's better, it's just different. And sometimes that helps me to maybe give more thought to the verse than otherwise. So that's at least my practice. It might be something that you find helpful. But I'm going to read first from the American Standard Version in James 4, verses 11 and 12. Speak not against another, brethren. He that speaketh against a brother or judgeth his brother, speaketh against the law, and judgest the law. But if thou judgest the law, thou art a doer of the law. Thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. One only is the lawgiver and judge, even he who is able to save and destroy. But who art thou, that thou judgest thy neighbor? All right, let me read it again in a little more modern rendition. And then let's see if we can just think about, what is James encouraging? What is he inviting us to think about? And it's almost a little awkward. It's at least to me, some of these lines, I say, well, what does that even mean? Or how does that connect? But as I have reflected on this and studied it for a while, and it's become a little bit clearer to me, what I think we will see is he is talking about a very, very common issue. Maybe something that we can relate to very easily. And so I'll read it again and then we'll think about it. He says, reading from the ESV, "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks evil against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law." What does that mean? "But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge, he is able to save and destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor?" Let's start with that question. Something I intend to do for my own just reflection as we get close to the end of the study of this letter is I want to go back and I want to collect all of the questions. Just have them on a list to think about. Because it's like this is part of his style, and he has asked a lot of questions, and here comes another one, and it really summarizes this need for people to think about. The question at the end of verse 12 is, who are you? This really gets to the heart of much of what he has to say. That a lot of our challenges, a lot of the conflicts, a lot of the problems in our world derive from how we think about ourselves. Are other people just there to be exploited? Or is there a deeper level to human relationships in life than just the accumulation of things and then dying? How do you see yourself as a part of God's creation? How do we perceive our lives in terms of meaning and purpose? Are we just consumers? Or should our lives have more depth and meaning? Is there more to reality than just this life? How we think about that determines how we think about ourselves. And he asks, who are you to stand in judgment against your neighbor? Now the curious thing is that's how the world perceives Christians. You are the people who judge other people. And James says don't do that. Right? Mm-hmm. That's right. That's exactly right. And you know, here is a passage where James kind of calls out the idea, who do you think you are to judge somebody else? And then my question is, well, who's James to judge me for judging somebody else? As we assess this verse and what James is calling our attention to, that is like a cancer in a family or in a workplace or in the church or in our world. There's something really negative and ruinous about what he's talking about that we ought to say, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to be like that. Whatever it is he is defining, he is not saying that if somebody has committed a crime, we shouldn't judge them. If somebody is a habitual liar, well, we shouldn't hold them accountable. Don't judge anybody. He is not saying we should never identify crimes or moral issues or destructive behaviors and hold people accountable. He's not saying that. He is talking about a critical spirit. Not all types of judgments or evaluations. And Jeff pointed out where Jesus encouraged us to not judge according to appearance. Okay, not superficial or hypocritical, but judge righteous judgments. In fact, we have a responsibility to hold ourselves accountable, hold our loved ones accountable when they're involved in destructive behaviors. Everybody knows that. Or if you have a neighbor who you know in the neighborhood is committing crimes, selling drugs, or whatever it is, exploiting children, selling drugs to children, you have an obligation to judge that person. Do you not? He is talking about a mean-spirited, hypercritical mindset that takes delight in finding and exposing the faults of others. And sometimes perceived faults, not real faults. And everybody knows, whether it's in a family circle, social circle of any kind, at the workplace, if you have someone who's always creating conflict and talking about people, creating unrest, being negative, lying, fault-finding, that doesn't go well. Never does, anywhere. I don't care what workplace or what tribe in Australia you're talking about. It never goes well when people, as human beings, in a social setting, have someone who is creating conflict by being mean-spirited, hateful, and fault-finding. That's what he's talking about. Not legitimate judgments and honest accountability. Now, as we go back and as we think about this, let's see what the connections are between this talk of being a judge and judging the law and why this is explanatory when he says we shouldn't be like this. Speak not against one another. This is the hypercritical, fault-finding spirit that he is addressing. Now, here's his rationale, which again carries no weight with people in general, but if you believe in God and the values of Jesus Christ, this is supposed to be encouraging or admonishing to give thought to how we speak about other people. Because the one who speaks against his brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law. Now, let's just take that part. What's really going on here when someone not has a slip of the tongue, but when someone's lifestyle is to be hypercritical, fault-finding, and hateful. I mean, they never run into a fault they don't like to talk about and expose. What about that? James says this person has a spiritual problem because they're seeing themselves. Let me use a more colloquial expression. They see themselves as above the law. Now, whether it's the Old Testament law or the law of liberty that he refers to in the book, the law of Christ, the moral, spiritual values that are communicated to us, that are wholesome to family and work and church environments, that moral teaching is that we should restrain this type of talk. That we ought to accentuate the values that people have. Not overlooking legitimate faults, but not finding sport in celebrating and being malicious in intent by highlighting negative things. He says when a person has gone into that as a lifestyle, as a habit, they have disregarded the teaching of the law about how to treat other people. It's as if it doesn't apply to them, and they get to live in this realm of condescension and superiority and talk down about everybody else. Well, it may be. But the problem he points out is that they are not applying the law to themselves. And that's the sense in which he says, you're speaking against the law. It's as if you're saying, this law doesn't apply to me and I can be a judge. That's why this question ends the section, who do you think you are? One of the values of the teachings of Jesus is that it helps us deep down into our heart have a proper and spiritual perspective of ourselves, our place in the world, and the value of other people. It makes environments better to be compassionate and thoughtful and restrained. And so this is the sense of speaking against the law and becoming a judge of the law, saying, well, no, that's not for me. And then he says, if that be the case, if you are a judge of the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. And here's the problem, verse 12. There's only one judge. There's only one moral lawgiver and judge. He doesn't even refer to God by name, but he says he's the one who is the ruler of the world. He created it, it's his, he's the ruler. That's the meaning of he save or destroys. He is the ruler, the all-wise, all-powerful ruler. And so he invites us to give serious thought to how we think and how we interact in these settings. Now, as we look at verse 13 and following, we see that he begins to encourage a certain way of thinking. As you see on the chart, he says, you should not what? Be hypercritical, fault-finding as a way of life, as a rule, as a way to, pump ourselves up in relation to other people, whatever it might be. Not that way. See ourselves in a proper light. And that would involve even how we conduct our business. And so you should, verses 11 through 17, really be thinking about the place that God has in your life, in your plans. So let's read these verses and give them some consideration. Come now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into this city and spend a year there and trade and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. What is your life? There's another question. For you are a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanishes away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we will both live and do this or that. But now ye glory in your vauntings. All such glory is evil. I don't know what vauntings is, but it sounds bad, right? We'll look here at a more natural rendition in a second. So to him, therefore, that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. Maybe you've quoted that before, thought about that, heard it many, many times. What place does that have in the whole section? That will be something for us to think about. So let me reread it in the ESV. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? If you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. That's what vauntings are. All such boasting is evil. Why is that? So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. James considers this hypothetical where someone has a plan, someone has a business opportunity, and they've made these plans. It's a well thought out plan, and here is what they're prepared to launch out and do. He is not saying that that is a bad thing, is he? What is he highlighting as a potential problem? Leaving God out of the equation. Now let's see how he invites us to think about this. You should not, well, he says, be mean-spirited and hypercritical. And the problem when you're doing that is, again, you're leaving God out. You're setting aside his moral instruction and just saying, I'm kind of above that. Well, there's more than one way to set God aside and not respect him as your creator and heavenly Father. Someone might say, well, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not mean-spirited or hypercritical or judging other people or whatever. There's more than one way to dismiss God. You know, sometimes people will say, I don't need God to be good. Well, if there is no God, there is no good. It's true, there are many people who are unbelievers who are good people. That's not the question. The question is there such a thing as good if there is no God? It becomes all arbitrary. And here is someone, hypothetically, who just has their plan, they're living their life, they're going to consume, they're going to accumulate. And James says, let me ask you a question. What is your life? Or to put it maybe in a more particular way, what's going to happen when you die? Well, nothing. Are you so sure? Then we just start working our way back to say, what is the best explanation for everything we see? You may not need God to be good, but you explain to me why good exists. Explain to me why people universally everywhere feel moral obligations and prescriptions. That is, no matter who you're talking about or where you're talking about or any time, human beings are wired to think about good. Is it good to protect children? Is it good to be compassionate? Is it good to educate our children? Is it good to protect them from harm? Is that good? Should you do that? In fact, when people don't protect children, what do we think about them? It's inexcusable. Well, why not? If good is simply subjective and arbitrary. James says we need to think about our lives. We need to think about really where we stand. Is there a God or not? Is there a creator or not? Is Christianity the one true religion of the one true God or not? We can act like none of these questions exist and roll the dice and see what happens after death. James says, here's the inexcusable thing. When Christian people forget to consider God in their plans. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. You're not even considering where God may fit in to your future. Mark? Yeah, that's the MEV, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, Jesus told the story of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12 and again invites us to think about what's going to happen when you die. That's why I said at the beginning, James, he kind of makes us uncomfortable at times because he forces us to ask some questions that we like to just pretend don't exist for decades. But they are the real tough questions about reality and meaning and eternity. What is important? And so here then is the essence of what he's saying. You should think about the place of God in your life. So he's not against making a profit. He is not against making good deals. He is not any way condemning doing good by your family and trying to do better. He is acknowledging, yeah, that's all fine and good, but what you should do is say, if the Lord wills, and notice particularly, I don't know how many times I've misquoted this verse through the years. I used to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. That's not all it says, right? If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. We talked about a couple of weeks ago the reality that God is the creator and owner of his creation, is the ruler and therefore in control. Now, that doesn't mean God causes everything that happens to happen. But we do recognize from the teaching of the Bible of God's relationship to his creation that he does have a purpose. He does have a plan. That doesn't mean every detail of our life is planned out. I'm not saying that. But he does have a scheme or a purpose of why he made the world and us as he did. And he permits certain things. He intervenes at times. Some things he causes, and he makes judgments. James says that we should be thinking about who God is and how he relates to us. If the Lord wills, that could be a lot of things. That could be simply him allowing something to happen. It could be an intervention. Could be a lot of things depending on the many avenues God has to interact with us. But it is a humble acknowledgement on our part that He is my God. He is my Lord. And I want everything I do and everything I plan to have His blessings, to have His help, to have His permission, as I try to make a better life for me and my family. That's what James invites us to do. And the conclusion that he draws, first from a negative and then from an exhortation point of view, is when we're living a life where we've set God aside, isn't that actually arrogant? Isn't it arrogant for a created being to act like the Creator doesn't exist? And in so doing, you think all of your success, all of your plans totally hinge on your amazing gifts. Forget there's somebody else involved. That's arrogant. Christian people ought to know better, and though that's why he says, therefore, verse 17 is connected, therefore, you know to do the right thing, which here is what? Consider God every day. The things you aspire to do and hope to do and succeed in, that's the right thing to do. And if you're leaving God out, you know it's sin. James is trying to help us be better people. And there's just absolutely no doubt that when families, when people on their jobs, in the church, in neighborhoods, when people adopt the teaching of Jesus Christ, it makes for a better world. Thank you for being here today. We'll look forward to continuing our study of the letter of James.